Welcome everyone to the 9th SIGPHIL at ICIS workshop, an annual event that we hold at ICIS to discuss the hottest contemporary issues in the philosophy of information systems. This year we decided to use the workshop as a developmental tool to support authors who are planning to submit to the Journal of Information Technology special issue on products of theorizing towards native theories of emerging technology. The deadline for the submission of this special issue has been moved to March the 1st, 2022, to allow more people to submit and get involved in this very important discussion about the need for native theories in information systems. As the call for papers noted, the goal of this special issue is to showcase exemplars of native products of theorizing, not theories, because we understand that it takes time for a viable theory to emerge. So we're taking baby steps here by developing the interim conceptual artifacts, whether they are IS-specific questions, myths we need to debunk, analogies, metaphors, paradigms, or models that can eventually be included in the future native IS theory. In addition to discussing products of theorizing, we want authors to apply those products of theorizing to emerging IT, not all technology, because we believe that's where the value of these products of theorizing lie, within the context of discovery in addressing difficult, intractable problems that we're facing today that are in many cases amplified by new technologies. So I've been asked to explain what are products of theorizing anyway? So let me share my screen. I hope you can see that. Go. So what are products of theorizing? In short, it's nothing less than the stuff of scholars. Yes, if we want to be scholars, or at least scholarly, products of theorizing are what we need to be well versed in. Now, what evidence do I have to back this up? Take the case of Aristotle. Now, I'm going to read what he wrote in topics, but don't run away. I will unpack in simple language what he wrote. So hopefully you'll see the relevance to what we're talking about today. So he wrote, the observation of likeness is useful with a view both to inductive arguments and to hypothetical deductions, and also with a view to the production of definitions. It is useful for inductive arguments because it is by means of an induction of particulars in cases that are similar that we claim to induce the universal. For it is not easy to do this if we do not know the points of likeness. It is useful for hypothetical deductions because it is a reputable opinion that among similars, what is true of one is true also of the rest. Right, what exactly is he talking about? Well, he's actually talking about the metaphor. One of the products of theorizing. So what's a metaphor? A metaphor is giving a thing a name that belongs to something else. And that's not the same as an analogy. So we'll go into that later. Anyway, for example, when the computer was first invented, there was a need to explain to the public what the computer is all about. So the computer scientists and later journalists took it up. They used the metaphor of the brain to describe the computer's CPU. In one stroke, they were able to use well-known functions of the brain, like processing information, to explain something unfamiliar at the time, computer processing. So the CPU was given the name, the brain of the computer. As you can see, the brain belongs to the human being, but the CPU was given that name that belonged to something else. So the metaphor, the physical brain here, was able to harness an entire network of analogies to make that connection. So Which one is the analogy and which one is the metaphor? An analogy is a rational argument. The metaphor of the brain draws on that argument, that the CPU also processes information, just like the brain, and is therefore capable of what the brain is doing. So the metaphor carries the analogies to create an elegant way of explaining something that's not familiar to most people at the time. So going back to Aristotle, he wrote, the observation of likeness is useful for both inductive and deductive reasoning. He's describing here the skill that scholars need in order to craft good metaphors, which is to be able to perceive likeness, especially in things that are very different. For example, the brain is a squishy living entity, but the CPU is a hard, metallic, non-living thing. Theorizing is being able to find that connection between those different things, being able to find the likeness and use it to our advantage. In fact, one of the most famous of Aristotle's inventions, the syllogism, the basis of science for all time, really, is the process of finding likeness in dissimilar things. Another example that's close to our time of perceiving likeness is the case of John Snow. You might be familiar with this. In 1854, he connected the dots of the cases of deaths that were occurring in London from cholera. And he was able to single out the source of that cholera epidemic that was ravaging London at the time to a single water pump on Broad Street. Now, this is an example of inductive reasoning using the observation of likeness. See, one of the advantages of distinguishing between the different products of theorizing is that it allows us to tease out, to find the jewels of insights about the phenomenon we're investigating, increasing the chances of us making a discovery. Let's go on to another product of theorizing, the model. Now, in research, many cannot tell the difference between a model and a framework, and they use them interchangeably. So hopefully this example will clarify their differences. So a Nobel laureate, Thomas Schelling, describes the case of why, in his book, he describes the case of why a measles epidemic came back to a poor country after it was eradicated. So you see, the story is that in the beginning, most infants in the country were already vaccinated. So the very small amount, or very small number of unvaccinated could not sustain an epidemic. But after the measles was eradicated, mothers forgot about the epidemic and stopped bringing their babies in for vaccination. So the large number of new unvaccinated babies invited the next epidemic. You know, just like when we feel cold in our home, we crank up the heat, right? So what happens is that even though the right temperature is reached, the heat that was stored already raised the temperature above the setting. And we can't lower the temperature right away. We have to wait an hour or so before the temperature starts going down again. So humans behave in a similar cyclical way. The stock market, for example, is a good example of this behavior, causing booms and crashes. So what the model of heating and cooling here allows us to do is to address the problem at a practical level. The model functions beyond the metaphor and the analogy. We can use models, for example, to make accurate predictions. So why is a model different from a metaphor? Or rather, why is a model different from a framework, I was going to say. So first, the model is just an abstraction, whereas the framework frames the whole research. A long time ago, Gilbert modeled the Earth like a magnet, which enabled him to explain why the compass points to the north. Just like Gilbert, you can use a model in research without knowing much about the phenomenon. So if someone were to ask you why you're doing the research, showing a model is not going to be enough. You instead might cite various different traditions that studied that phenomenon, the history of what you're studying, both of which are part of the phenomenon's research framework. In other words, the framework is much larger, is the map of the research. And a framework can contain many models, so they're not the same thing. when you build a framework, you know a lot about the phenomenon, and it inspires you perhaps to find suitable models for the study. The last product of theorizing I'll talk about is the concept. So the concept is really the culmination of all the hard work of theorizing. In fact, it's so important that another Nobel laureate, Sir George Thomson, said, concepts are more fundamental than theories which are stated in terms of them. They are so important that disciplines are known to the world because of their concepts. Concepts are what demarcates a discipline's subject matter. In other words, we know, for example, like respiration and circulation, evolution, these are all concepts that belong to biology. They are discipline specific. And for a long time, for millennia, the process of inventing new concepts, of coming up with these ideas throughout history, has always been a mystery to a lot of people, because it is the stuff of genius, the stuff of scholars who, coming up with these new concepts. There we go. All right. So let's go on a little bit more. All right. So these are the products of theorizing. Now, of course, obviously, this is not limited to the ones that you see in the list here. The picture that you see here was just put together in order to kind of help people understand the roles of how these products play in terms of research within the discursive formation of the field. So, Lars and Paul and myself, and this idea actually came from Lars. So Lars said, we should put it in this three boxes here, because it helps people think, what is a question? What does a question do? What does a paradigm do? Where is the concept? Concept is a component of a theory. A statement is a component of a theory. A hypothesis, similarly. So it's just to help people can understand where it's coming from. Essentially, the idea of the products of theorizing actually came from White. And I was reading White way back in 2000, forget now, early 2000s. And it didn't click to me until I read it like the fifth time. And he said the following. He said, products of the theorizing process. He said. So use the word products. And a lot of people have difficulty with the word products. They like to say, elements of theorizing or whatever. But White specifically used the word products of theorizing. And he said, these represent interim struggles in which people intentionally inch towards stronger theories. Those emergent products summarize progress, give direction, and serve as place markers. They have vestiges of theory, but are not themselves theories. So I have a picture here. You can see the 13 products of theorizing that add up eventually, with the hope that one day you'll inch towards, and of course, one day you'll reach that theory that we're looking for with the capital P. Of course, it's going to be a lot. I'm hoping for a lot of questions from everyone about this picture here. Okay, I'm gonna spend just maybe in the 5 or 6 minutes more, and we'll open up for questions. So the idea of the theory here is that theories are attached to a discipline's discourse. Just like when we look at biology, for example, right? And we have concepts in biology like respiration and circulation and all those things, right? And then those concepts are put into biological theories. And these theories, of course, emerge from this process of theorizing. So just in the case of biology, for example, so biology actually emerged way back in the 1800s because people were trying to understand what gives life. That was the question. What is it that sustains life? And in answering that question, a lot of theories were put together. And as a result, these theories and these products of theorizing allowed biology to emerge from natural history in the 1800s. And the process is it gave rise to certain organizations of concepts, certain regrouping of objects, certain types of enunciation,
which form, according to the degree of coherence and rigor and stability, themes and theories. So that's how, according to Foucault, how theories come about. Of course, there's a long discussion about this, but I'm just going to introduce that and leave it at that. Now, the $6 million question, of course, because part of the title of the special issue is that this is about native theories, native IS theories of emerging IT, right? So the question is, how are you supposed to recognize an original theory or native product from one that's not native? That's probably the $6 million question, right? How can we say that our research is original? What are some of the characteristics of an original product of theorizing or original theory, as opposed to a theory that's borrowed? So, so that's what the next slide kind of tries to argue, tries to persuade everyone here. So what I've done here is I put the non-native theory on one side and then native theories or non-native characteristics of products of theory or theorizing on one side, and the characteristics of native products of theorizing on the other side. So on the left side, an example of a non-native product of theorizing is when one researches in a different discipline. In other words, they're not researching the right object of study. You know, in the paper that was published, I suggested that, you know, when we study productivity of a certain thing, that's actually economics. And you'll be using all sorts of economic products of theorizing and concepts and variables in order to come up with a reason why IT is productive, for example, right? Now, it doesn't hit the nail on the head. And the reason why it doesn't hit the nail on the head, in my humble opinion, is because it's subordinated to economics. You are essentially researching in economics. You are not researching natively in IS. So in order to be native, you need to be subordinated to the discursive formation of IS. You should be asking questions that other disciplines are not asking. You're asking questions that are concerned with IS. In other words, is this an IS question? So that's one aspect of native theorizing. Another example of non-native theorizing is when you know, for example, again, I hate to mention this example, but let's just go with it. So when TEM was put together, essentially it was borrowed from, of course, we know, from TRA, and all the concepts, everything is taken from TRA, and it's rehashed, it's summarized, it's actually a watered down version of TRA, and that became TEM, of course. So doing that doesn't make it native. It is not necessarily an IS theory. Okay? And the reason why it's not native is because there are no rules. There are no new rules used in order to form what is being studied. It's the same rules that TRA put together. So we're just rehashing what is already there. We're not building a new path. We are just, you know, making the existing path a little bit more pretty, for example. Another example, and this is probably the last example, is if what we are introducing actively repositions, reorganizes existing knowledge. You know, when you have a framework, for example, of something you're studying, the elements of that framework is situated in a certain way. And when you've introduced a new product of theorizing, if that product of theorizing reorganizes how each of those existing products situate themselves, you've got something original. And let me give you an example of this. When Darwin was thinking about evolution, there was somebody else who thought of the same idea 50 years before him. His name was Lamarck. And I wanted to show the picture of the giraffe there because what Lamarck said was that evolution came about because the giraffe had to eat from the leaves of a tall tree because that's where they were. The trees were tall, and therefore, after hundreds of millions of years, the neck of the giraffe got longer because the giraffe was trying to reach up to the leaf on the tall tree. So that was what Lamarck essentially said. And it's kind of cosmological, if you will, meaning that it came out of the origins of the giraffe, right? Whereas Darwin said, no, it has nothing to do with that. Or it's not the main reason why evolution came about. Evolution came about because, and he's talking about the same thing, evolution, but he reorganized existing knowledge at the time, what Lamarck produced. He introduced new rules into how new species enters the living world. And as a result of that, what he came with, which is natural selection, is original, even though evolution has always been there because of the fact that he introduced those new rules and so on. So I'm going to stop there because I think I've talked too long, way too long for the introduction. So here is an example of some of the things that if you're looking to submit to the special issue, then these are the things that we should be looking for, or will be the editors of the special issue will be looking at. Essentially, have you clearly specified the products of theorizing that you want to elaborate on in the introduction? Way up there, here's the products of theorizing we're looking to elaborate on. Do you see actually this is coming out from the review process. So the relevance of the product theorizing for emerging IT, we'll be looking at the quality of the argument, the claim surrounding the product theorizing itself. Is this an IS specific disciplinary question that you are trying to address? And did the proposed product of theorizing here introduce non-trivial insights, challenge assumptions that you already have? And so on. And finally, if it helped somehow at least resolve the same loci problems that's directly linked to practical societal concerns in emerging technology. So I'll just stop there and open for questions before we go on to the first paper. I'm hoping to listen to a lot of your comments and questions of this whole idea of product of theorizing and coming up with native theories for IS. Thank you so much for listening. Let me just unshare and open up for questions. Please go ahead.
One of the things that I was wondering about when I wrote my paper was about looking at, I tend to do things that are fairly big, that cover a lot of ground. And actually, I found that it covered most of the products of theorizing, the stuff that I was talking about. And what I wonder is, let's say that I focus on one particular product of theorizing. Like, let's say I focus on metaphor. And I say, I'm talking about this thing, and this is a really interesting metaphor. But it's not a theory yet. It's just a metaphor that's really interesting. How is someone supposed to evaluate that when they put on their reviewer hat about whether that deserves to be published or not? Because it's not yet at the point that you actually have the theory. It's only a halfway measure toward a theory.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a great question, Stephen. In fact, that is the goal of the special issue. The goal of the special issue, and what we've received so far, actually half of what we received so far happen to be theories. Out of the 30 or so abstracts that we received, about 10 or so actually talked about theories that they wanted to impress us with and so on. And we wrote back to them saying, we're actually not discussing theories here. We're not at that point. And in fact, that's our kind of our humble admission to say that we're not yet ready. And at this stage of the advancing IS theories, we are just focusing on the products of theorizing, which, as you correctly stated, are not yet theories. So focusing on a metaphor, as you said just now, is exactly what we're looking for, because once you are able to, just like the example of the thermostat example I gave, or model, you know, the metaphor of the thermostat itself, which became the model for heating and cooling, and for measles infection actually. So when you're able to do that, what happens is that you're able to build that part of the theory, which will eventually become a theory, in other words, right? So you're able to describe the details, for example, of the model. And in fact, a good model is a model that can even be turned into a mathematical model to the point that you can predict, right? Here's a mathematical model that I built based on a metaphor that I put together. And this has successfully predicted how fast my widget is going to fly, or whatever it is that we're trying to do here, or how quickly the infection is going to spread. And then from that, you can then put together, you know, you will test that model. And if the model survives the test, repeated test, of course, then it becomes hopefully a theory that we can say, hey, I've come up with a theory that explains infection rates of COVID or Omicron, whatever it is, and this is how it works. So that's the goal of the special issue. It is actually to focus just on the products of theorizing. We're looking for exemplars of products of theorizing. Does that answer your question, Stephen? You're muted.
Let me give you a specific example, which is not the example that I wrote up for this purpose. I started thinking about the idea that information systems are kind of like services, in the sense that an information system does something for someone. And I know how to put together a large amount of ideas related to services because I've done some research about that. Separate from that, let's say I just turn in something that says information systems are like services. Where I happen to know that by going down that path, eventually I end up with a new definition of IS usage, but I haven't gotten there yet. I'm just talking about IS as services. How is someone to evaluate whether that's a meaningful metaphor?
Right. Yeah. So that list that I gave you earlier, let me just share that with you quickly again, is a list of criteria that we are using currently. And of course, we'll probably want to change that as we go through the process of editing this special issue. But the preliminary list that I showed, let me share my screen quickly again here. Okay, so I'm going to use just simple, I'm going to get rid of this for a moment here. Okay, so, sorry about that. So, so this is the list that we put together that's for reviewer, and we've actually passed this to the people who submitted the papers to review other papers. And the list says, you know, one way to evaluate the submission is obviously the quality of the arguments for the metaphor itself, whether the metaphor addresses an IS-specific disciplinary question, whether the metaphor that you're theorizing here you know, exposes an assumption that was hidden, whether the metaphor resolved some practical problems that, you know, has been intractable in the past, for the past history of that problem, and so on. So that a couple of ways in which that metaphor could be evaluated. Even if you come, you know, if you're able to do it just one or two, hey, that's better than what we have right now, you know, borrowing from other disciplines. So this is the baby steps I'd like to say that we're trying to encourage basically our authors to take. I'm going to go to Mialchik, so he has his hands raised, and then Lena after that. Go ahead.
Hi, Nick. Thank you for organizing this and giving me the opportunity to ask my question. What I have two related questions in a way. The first one is in my paper, I used actually the frame of paradigm, the evolutionary theory, to actually explore the information systems development and why information systems goes everywhere in every field and it touches. So you can say that I use the product of theorizing, which is a paradigm evolutionary theory, as a lens to, let's say, historically analyze why information systems are now everywhere in the field.
Right.
And based on that, again, reflecting on the idea of natural selection, I say, okay, natural selection, there should be a mechanism, and I use a metaphor to identify this mechanism. And my question is, in the same paper, I try to use two products of theorizing, and again, not reaching a theory, but more or less you can say, in a best case, I come up with a model that says, okay, when you design an information system in the ubiquitous information society, you need to include the mechanism which I identify as appropriate one.
Mm-hmm.
And in this direction, my question is it allowed we to, let's say, combine these products of theorizing as we see fit to achieve our, let's say, stage for theory development?
Mm-hmm.
And the second one, which I have a little bit doubts about, is that I use all this, the paradigm and the metaphor as a lens to reflect on this, let's say, happenings in the past 50 years of information systems development. And my question is this sufficient in a way? Because in a way, I feel that I just use different lenses. I provide justification for them, but again, like using different lenses to engage in theorizing, but I have not reached that level of theorizing. So is this in a way, let's say, reasonable?
On the right track, you mean?
Not reasonable, yeah, right on track, or it's not, yeah. Thank you.
Exactly, yeah, yeah. No, what you're doing is exactly what we're looking for, exactly what we're looking for. So the whole point of introducing the idea, the notion of this products of theorizing, is to open the black box of theorizing. You know, we've been doing research for years, but you know, it's kind of been like a monopoly of senior authors. You know, they're so good, they're able to theorize, they're able to, you know, that kind of thinking going on here. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to open that black box, and in that black box, we're able to use these tools in order to theorize. And what you've done is exactly that. You've started with a paradigm, and you're saying maybe a way of viewing ISD is through evolutionary paradigm, right?
Yeah.
And now, whether or not that paradigm fits the phenomenon, that's where the evaluation comes to the picture, right?
Okay.
The reviewer will say, okay, well, this doesn't fit, it doesn't make sense. So the fitting of the paradigm to the picture is the quality of your theorizing, because you're able to find what Aristotle was saying earlier, the likeness, the similarities between what's in that paradigm and what is in your phenomenon, right?
Okay.
So, and then from then on, you move on and say, okay, my paradigm works now. I think this paradigm is a good lens to use. I'm going to go deeper into another product of theorizing, which in your case, perhaps a metaphor.
Yeah.
And again, is this metaphor suitable for the phenomenon? Will this metaphor allow you to build eventually a model? Can you identify in that model the concepts and the relationships that you can put together and come up with a conclusion for something you're trying to predict, right? That's exactly what we're looking for. We're trying to get people to think that way in a methodical manner with standard language, or at least semi-standard language, right? Because everybody thinks differently. But through this process, somebody else who's listening and reading your ideas can get back to you and say, I like your idea. I think, why don't you look at this other product theorizing and try this one and see it will work better. Things like that, right? So to conclude, I think you're right on track. Keep at it, and I think you'll get somewhere. I think that's going to be hopefully useful. Lena, please go ahead.
Thank you.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I've got a question, and with regards to the native versus non-native, you mentioned native versus non-native concepts, and then also non-native products of theorizing. And you mentioned TAM, right, which was, widely used, especially in our field. And then I was thinking, okay, which other theories are we using quite frequently, like, affordance theory, social materiality, social technical theory, which all have the IT artifact in focus and also in center. But, especially affordance theory is not a native IS theory, right? So yeah, I was just trying to get my head around. Yeah.
Right.
Then.
So I don't have too long to answer your question because we need to get to the first discussion coming up in a minute. But the issue is not so much that we're looking at, an IT artifact for one. It's not so much that. It's how whatever you're introducing adds to the body of knowledge by way of changing the rules, by way of repositioning, by way of uncovering assumptions. And of course, the IT artifact is useful when it comes to, addressing a socio-technical phenomenon, right? Which is what we're supposed to be specializing in, right? That's the focus. Our focus is that we bridge, computer science and the social sciences, and if we can do a good job of that, that's where we can say, okay, I think we've come up with something that's original. Again,
but it's kind of the newness, right?
That's right. Quick, short answer to what you asked there. All right, awesome. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you.
We are now ready to start with our first paper.